This scenario illustrates the psychological pressure of isolation during a crisis. In such situations, the body's physiological response to blood loss becomes the primary survival factor. The time window for effective self-treatment is often measured in minutes, not hours. This mirrors high-pressure decision-making in other crisis contexts, where immediate action is critical. The mechanism involves prioritizing the most immediate threat to vital functions. Without external aid, the individual must rely on available materials and knowledge. This pattern of self-reliance under extreme duress is a documented psychological and physiological challenge. The outcome hinges on applying correct procedures before cognitive functions degrade. This incident represents a rare category of survival stories, where the victim must become their own emergency surgeon. The victim's response was an act of extreme, improvised medicine, using a tooth from the very shark that attacked them to close their own wound. Such improvised medical procedures are documented in survival literature, often involving using available materials to control bleeding or close wounds. The mechanism involves using a sharp, rigid object to approximate wound edges when conventional medical tools are unavailable. This pattern appears in various survival contexts, from wilderness accidents to maritime emergencies where victims must self-treat serious injuries. Comparatively, this level of improvisation exceeds typical first aid and enters the realm of field surgery, requiring both physical and psychological resilience. The psychological component is significant, as performing self-surgery under duress requires overcoming natural aversion to self-harm. This reality demonstrates human adaptability in extreme situations where conventional medical help is inaccessible. This scenario represents a classic wilderness medicine emergency: traumatic injury in a remote aquatic environment. The primary threats are exsanguination from arterial bleeding and rapid onset infection from marine bacteria. Marine predators like sharks possess serrated teeth designed to create deep, tearing wounds that are difficult to close. Seawater contains vibrio and other pathogens that can cause necrotizing fasciitis within hours. The victim's survival depends on immediate hemorrhage control, using any available material as an improvised tourniquet or pressure dressing. This isolates the individual in a resource vacuum, where standard medical protocols are impossible to follow. The psychological shock from such an attack can impair cognitive function, complicating self-rescue efforts. Ultimately, it becomes a race between stabilizing the injury and reaching advanced medical care. The injury was a laceration, not a catastrophic loss of limb. This critical distinction means the wound was a deep cut that bled profusely, but the underlying structure remained intact. The preserved musculature and tissue architecture allowed for the possibility of surgical closure and recovery. In medical terms, this type of injury involves severe bleeding, but maintains the biological framework needed for healing. The mechanics differ fundamentally from traumatic amputations, where reattachment is the primary concern. This factual understanding of the wound's nature is central to analyzing the subsequent survival narrative. A traumatic amputation would render this specific action impossible due to the loss of limb function. The second critical factor was the survivor's presence of mind immediately following the attack. This mental state allowed them to recognize and retrieve a key piece of evidence from the scene. A tooth from the shark was found either embedded in the wound or in the immediate vicinity. Shark teeth are composed of dentin and enamel, making them extremely hard and sharp objects. The survivor identified this tooth as a solid, sharp object that could serve as potential evidence. Securing the tooth required both physical capability and cognitive awareness during a traumatic event. This action demonstrates how physical evidence can be preserved even in chaotic situations. The individual's ability to maintain composure during extreme shock and duress demonstrates remarkable psychological resilience. This composure was essential for executing a critical medical procedure under primitive conditions. The tooth served as an improvised piercing tool for wound closure, functioning as a biological staple. This technique involved using the tooth to pierce through the skin flaps on either side of a laceration. The method is analogous to basic surgical stapling or suturing, which are standard for approximating tissue. Such improvisation reflects a deep understanding of wound management principles, even without conventional tools. The sharpness and strength of the tooth were crucial for effectively penetrating the skin without causing additional damage. This approach highlights how resourcefulness can bridge gaps in medical availability during critical situations. The improvised suturing described was a desperate measure to control bleeding, not a sterile medical procedure. This method, known as wound approximation, aims to bring skin edges together to facilitate clotting and reduce blood loss. In survival situations, people have historically used available materials like fishing line, dental floss, or even hair for similar purposes. The primary goal was immediate hemorrhage control, prioritizing survival over infection prevention or cosmetic outcome. This contrasts sharply with modern surgical protocols, which emphasize sterility, specialized sutures, and precise technique to minimize complications. However, significant gaps and common misconceptions exist regarding the specific circumstances and outcomes of this event. The exact materials used, the environment, and the individual's subsequent medical course remain unclear from the available account. Such improvisation, while documented in extreme cases, carries high risks of infection, poor healing, and nerve or tissue damage. The incident involved a shark attack, though the exact species remains unverified in available records. Geographic details are similarly unclear, with second-hand accounts providing inconsistent location information. The rescue timeline cannot be precisely reconstructed from the fragmented accounts that have survived. This lack of verified medical documentation is common in cases where records are lost or never properly maintained. Without official records, details about the surgical procedure performed remain speculative. The subsequent infection risk in such scenarios typically involves multiple factors, including wound contamination and delayed treatment. Second-hand accounts often undergo alteration as they're retold, compromising factual accuracy over time. This pattern of information degradation is observed in many historical incidents where primary documentation is absent. The shark's tooth served as a primitive surgical instrument, not a magical healing artifact. Like any foreign object introduced into tissue, it carried significant contamination risks. The tooth's rough surface and biological origin made it particularly dangerous for wound introduction. This created ideal conditions for bacterial colonization and subsequent severe infection. Similar risks exist with any non-sterile object used in emergency medical situations. The misconception stems from confusing tool functionality with inherent healing properties. Modern medical protocols emphasize sterile instruments specifically to prevent such infections. The historical use of improvised tools often resulted in complications from secondary infections. The critical factor in this medical scenario was the action of closing the wound to mitigate blood loss. This principle is a cornerstone of field medicine, where immediate intervention can determine survival. Another point of confusion arises from the simplicity of the act itself. It was not a delicate surgical procedure requiring specialized equipment or extensive training. In emergency contexts, effective measures are often straightforward applications of fundamental principles. This contrasts with the assumption that life-saving interventions must always be complex or technologically advanced. The mechanism relies on basic physiology. Stopping hemorrhage preserves critical blood volume and oxygen delivery. This pattern is seen across various emergency response protocols, where clear, prioritized actions are standardized. The procedure described would have been an extreme measure, not a medical protocol. It represents a brutal, desperate application of a core survival principle, controlling catastrophic bleeding by any means necessary. This principle is found in various high-stakes survival scenarios, from wilderness emergencies to certain historical events. The story's insight is not about confronting external threats, like sharks, but about managing an internal, immediate crisis. It highlights the grim calculus of survival, where the priority shifts from long-term health to preventing immediate death. Such measures are a last resort, taken when standard options have failed or are unavailable. The mechanism involves direct, often crude intervention to stop major blood loss, which is a leading cause of preventable death and trauma. This pattern contrasts sharply with controlled medical environments, underscoring the severity of the situation described. Improvisation under pressure is a core survival principle, not just a dramatic concept. This principle applies directly to medical emergencies in isolated settings, where standard supplies are absent. For instance, controlling severe bleeding is a critical priority, as blood loss can be fatal within minutes. Effective wound closure can be achieved with improvised materials like clean cloth, adhesive tape, or even certain natural fibers. This contrasts with relying on specialized gear, which may fail, be lost, or simply not be available. Therefore, survival training emphasizes understanding fundamental mechanisms, like how to create pressure or a sterile barrier, over memorizing equipment lists. This knowledge-based approach builds adaptable competence, applicable to building shelter or signaling for help with found objects. Ultimately, it is the application of core principles with available resources that defines successful improvisation in a crisis. This medical principle illustrates a fundamental hierarchy in emergency response. In remote or resource-limited environments, immediate threats must be addressed before secondary concerns. Life-threatening hemorrhage represents the most urgent priority because blood loss can cause death within minutes. Infection, while serious, typically develops over hours or days, allowing for delayed intervention. This triage approach is standard in wilderness medicine, disaster response, and military field care. The availability of antibiotics enables this calculated risk, treating infection after immediate survival is secured. This medical hierarchy mirrors decision-making patterns in other high-stakes fields, where resources are limited. Understanding these priorities can mean the difference between life and death when seconds count. This psychological sequence, survive the initial crisis, assess the damage, identify a solution, and execute it, is a documented pattern in survival psychology. It represents a cognitive shift where the brain's executive functions override the amygdala's panic response, enabling logical action under extreme stress. This ability to self-administer critical aid is not unique to wilderness survival. It parallels the mental state required by individuals discovering a financial scam. In such fraud cases, the victim must first recognize the threat to their assets, diagnose the deceptive mechanisms at play, and then take decisive, often difficult, steps to secure what remains. The common factor is mental resilience, the capacity to suppress emotional shock in favor of procedural, problem-solving logic during a traumatic event. This decisive chain of action whether applied to a physical wound or a financial one, often determines the ultimate outcome, making self-reliance the critical first response. The shark's tooth was merely the physical object, but the true instrument of deception was the human mind making calculated decisions. This illustrates how fraud often uses ordinary items as props, while the real mechanism operates through psychological manipulation. The decision-making mind represents the core of many scams, where perpetrators weigh risks and rewards systematically. Similar patterns appear in corporate fraud, where executives use legitimate tools while making unethical decisions behind them. The shark's tooth serves as a metaphor for how deceptive schemes often have an innocent-seeming surface element. This dynamic appears in various fraud types, from investment scams to false advertising, where the visible tool distracts from the mental manipulation.